This is two happy people in love walking along the beach by the blue ocean at sunset. This is two
Hello everyone, Jay Warden here, and welcome to my recap and review of the episode Loud as a Whisper. An average episode with a novel concept as we meet a deaf negotiator with a unique form of communication. Don't forget those spoilers, otherwise, enjoy. The Enterprise is picking up a chap called Reaver to transport to the Solea system to mediate a peace between two warring factions. Reaver is legendary for his peacemaking skills, which makes Worf a little uncomfortable, as apparently Reaver brokered several peace treaties with the Klingons because we haven't invented the character of Curzon Dax yet. Picard reassures him and then beams down with Worf and Troy to greet Reaver. After being briefly ignored, Reaver arrives, silently appraises everyone, and then stands on a podium as three others arrive and start speaking. It turns out Reaver is completely deaf, but also telepathic, and in a rather unique form of communication, these three people speak as Reaver on specific matters of intellect, passion, and harmony. His chorus, if you will. After a bit more boring exposition on the nature of this little setup, they all finally beam up to the ship and head off to the warring planet. On the bridge, more introductions are made, but it seems Reaver is quite taken with Troy, who asks that she conduct him personally to his quarters along with his passion translator, while the remaining translators are taken to separate quarters. Reaver then lays on the charm and invites Troy to dinner, who seems quite receptive, though she's hoping that eventually three won't be a crowd for them to communicate with each other more intimately. Later in the conference room, Reaver is given a briefing on the situation before them, but Reaver doesn't want to know the specifics, saying that whatever the conflict was originally about, it's long since forgotten and it's now personal, and he needs to find a way to make peace personal as well, whilst boasting how he's never failed to broker a peace, no matter how difficult. With the conference done, he can get back to the business of charming Troy, as they dine together in his quarters. Troy still feels a bit uncomfortable having a third wheel in the room, so Reaver dismisses the passion translator and the two attempt to communicate via sign and feeling, and Troy is finally feeling the charm. Eventually the ship arrives in orbit and announces their arrival to the locals, who have resumed fighting with each other despite a ceasefire. They're not interested in talking to Picard though, so he summons Reaver to the bridge, much to his annoyance, and he finally gets through to the locals that they need to resume the ceasefire so he can do his thing and broker a peace to which they agree. Reaver picks out a suitable site and beams down with Riker and Worf. Eventually the two warring sides arrive and Reaver begins his speech, but it all goes quickly tits up when one of the locals decides he doesn't want peace and tries to kill Reaver, instead hilariously vaporizing his chorus. The faction leader kills his lieutenant and begs him to stay, but Riker is having none of it and quickly gets him beamed back to safety. With the death of his chorus, Reaver is beside himself with despair and frustration now that he can't communicate properly anymore, with Picard just as frustrated, so tells Data to learn the appropriate sign language he needs, and fast, whilst trying to reassure Reaver that he's not alone and they'll find a way to make this work. But despite a medical exam from Pulaski and help from Troy, Reaver remains withdrawn, despondent, and uncooperative. Data though, as promised, has quickly learnt the necessary sign language skills, so they try once again to get through to Reaver. He explains that what happened is all his fault, and how his arrogance about his own greatness led to the deaths of his beloved chorus. But despite a plea from the warring factions that they want to try the peace talks again, Reaver still doesn't want to help and storms off. Troy isn't willing to let it go though, so goes to his quarters to try one more time, and after some psychological prodding, manages to convince him to continue the negotiations by turning his current disadvantage into an advantage. And by that he intends to form a common ground between the factions by having them spend the next few months learning sign language so that they can talk to him to form a common bond. Because that'll totally work, of course. On the surface, Reaver has them beam down a table, reassures Riker that all will be well and not to worry about him, and so they beam up to the ship while Reaver stands waiting. Finally, as they prepare to leave orbit, Picard thanks Troy for a job well done and they head off to their next adventure. Well, I have to say this was a rather novel concept of an episode, but like much of early TNG, the concept is never quite fully realised or as interesting as it could have been, though certainly it's a better effort than many previous episodes. This isn't a bad episode, but it's not particularly memorable either, and a very talky one with little plot, being much more of a character piece than anything else. It is, however, very rare to see a deaf person taking centre stage on a TV show, and this in itself is quite welcome, as the writers find a way to make sure we understand who and what Reaver is all about, with a combination of his chorus talking for him and Reaver's own body language, and is played well by Howie Seago, who is actually deaf. As such, I think the episode was quite successful in making the audience see the chorus as mere conduits for Reaver, giving them pretty much no personality or character at all, merely being an extension of Reaver's personality instead. That said, it would have been interesting to see how the chorus themselves work when not with Reaver, what kind of lives they have and so forth, but there's only so much you can fit into a 45-minute episode, so best left to your imagination in this case perhaps. Of note here though is a first time appearance on Star Trek for Randy Oglesby, perhaps best known as Dagra in Season 3 of Enterprise, but has also played several other roles across the franchise. He makes the best impression here, and Marnie Mosiman does a fine job too, whereas Leo Damien as the passionate side of Reaver was completely devoid of any passion or feeling in his monotone performance. Anyway, despite being a novel idea and concept, too much time is wasted on multiple introductions, expositing on the history of Reaver's people, and the concept is then wasted when the chorus is killed by a disgruntled alien. I do get what they were going for here. Reaver is extremely self-assured, confident, and arrogant in his abilities because he's never failed at brokering a peace, and they want us to see how he deals with it once his support mechanism is taken away. This is all fine, but I think what should have happened is having less time spent on meandering intros and exposition, instead getting to the conference quicker, where we can see Reaver actually in action to see why he's so good at what he does and how his chorus make that work. Once you establish that, then you can kill them and see how Reaver deals with the loss afterwards. I just think that would have made more of an impact in the story. Instead, he just spends a couple of scenes being petulant until Troy basically manipulates him into realizing he can still do his job, but just in a different and challenging way. The alien factions themselves are one-dimensional, and we learn nothing interesting about them or the conflict, simply being a backdrop for Reaver's story. Like many Trek episodes, it's a little too neatly and easily solved at the end, and I really don't buy that these two factions, who have spent countless years warring with each other, would have the patience to spend months trying to talk to a guy by learning sign language. I get the idea, sure, but trying to create a shared bond or experience by having them learn to communicate with Reaver, I just think it's too simplistic, not to mention unrealistic. As for the crew, somewhat like Season 1's Too Short a Season, they're mostly along for the ride this time as a taxi service for the main guest star who takes centre stage. It's only towards the end they take a more active role in helping Reaver out. I do think it's odd that, despite being an apparently legendary negotiator, none of the crew knew about his deafness or way of communicating. Didn't anyone at least read the brief on this guy before they met him? Data quickly learning sign language was good, and there was a fun moment where he starts showing off to Picard his new skills. Pairing Reaver up with Troy was fairly smart given her empathic abilities, and I think she did a fairly good job of essentially manipulating him at the end into realizing he can still do what he came to do. Where Troy didn't work was at the beginning, where she pretty much invades Worf's privacy and calls him out on his stress in front of Picard and Riker. I think that was unprofessional and should have been done in private, not embarrassingly in front of your CO. Another nice moment is Reaver's brief interaction with Geordi, who of course has his own disability, and the two immediately and understandably share a bond over how they neither resent it and even see it as an advantage in perspective that others don't have. It's a nice touch. Speaking of Geordi, the episode introduces an idea here that Pulaski could potentially regenerate his normal vision through experimental procedures, meaning that he'd never have to use the visor again. The episode treats this as if it will be something that will be developed later on in the season, but in reality is something we'll never actually see or hear about again. LeVar Burton had at one time campaigned for Geordi's sight to be eventually restored to him, and as I've mentioned before in the Season 1 episode Hide and Q, Burton has extremely expressive eyes that would have been a huge asset to his character, so this scene was likely added as a way to prepare for this possibility, and I think it's a shame the idea was dropped after this. Finally, this is also the second and last of two instances of a holographic display being used in the Captain's Ready Room, the first being in the Season 2 opener, The Child. Presumably they stopped doing this for budgetary reasons, but I think it looks pretty cool all the same. However, it serves no function to the plot here at all, merely just being an odd mystery to Picard about a planet's odd orbit with no answer ever given. So, an average episode, but unlike the outrageous O'Connor, definitely a watchable one. It's not particularly riveting watching, mind you. Some might be rather bored by it all as it's very talky with little plots, but I think it's worth the watch simply for the novel concept posited here with Reaver's condition and his chorus. Next time we meet a dying man who claims he's basically Data's grandfather, who has nefarious intentions regarding his eventual fate in the episode, The Schizoid Man. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did then please do check out my other reviews as well, and also if you haven't yet then please like, subscribe and share. Until next time, this is Jay Warden, signing off.